The name of this presentation is, What if Jesus never lived? What would our world be like? My research is based upon two books, What if Jesus had never been born and Who is this man? Plus other bibliographies and references and other research I have completed. At the time of these individuals' deaths, Alexander the Great, Muhammad, and Napoleon, they had huge reputations worldwide. At the time that Jesus died, there was little reputation and little knowledge of it. However, 50 years later, Christianity had spread to Africa, the Middle East, and all of the Roman Empire, and 1,000 years later, the legacy of Christ laid the foundation of much of Europe, and Christian communities extended from Greenland to China. One of my favorite movies is It's a Wonderful Life. And in this movie, the character, George Bailey, wanted to die because of circumstances in his life. And an angel appeared and gave him a glimpse of what the world might look like, at least in Bedford Falls, where he lived, if in fact he was not there to produce the change that was necessary. And what he saw, it was an ugly world. It was Pottersville. Now, I'm here to say that I don't know what the world would be like socially if Jesus had not lived. I think it would be a lot like Pottersville than it would be Bedford Falls because of the impact that he had made. But we will see. Friedrich Nietzsche, an atheistic philosopher, wrote that I call Christianity the one great curse, the one enormous and innermost perversion, the one great instinct of revenge. I call it the one immortal blemish of mankind. So according to his writings, the world would have been a lot better off if there had not been Christianity. Well, let's see what would have happened if Jesus never came. There would have been no crucifixion or resurrection, no rise of the church, no New Testament scriptures, no teaching ministries, no monasteries and communities, monastic communities, no Notre Dame, Francis of Assisi, no Mother Teresa or Martin Luther King. No civilizing of the Saxon in England, the Franks in France, or the Vikings in Norway. Much of Europe today would have been much different had it not been for the Christian influence. No Charles Martel to defeat the Muslim invasion in Europe in 732 AD. No King James Bible along with Shakespeare that shaped the English language. No Dante's Divine Comedy, which shaped the Italian language. No Martin Luther, whose German Bible shaped the German language. And no codifying and setting to writing many of the world's languages, primarily done by missionaries and an attempt to put their language into writing so that they could read. No inspiration of the world's greatest art, music, and architecture. No pilgrims landing in Plymouth. No Declaration of Independence based upon the principles set forth. Now, many of our popular sayings today that we take for granted came from the Bible. Turn the other cheek, rise and shine, twinkling of an eye, scapegoat, drop in the bucket, united we stand, divided we fall. Pride comes before the fall, gentle answer turns away anger. Many of these are wise sayings, by the sweat of your brow. Nothing new under the sun, no one can serve two masters. A law unto himself, cast the first stone, blind leading the blind. Spare the rod, spoil the child, and a good Samaritan. Obviously, something else would have replaced that. Now, Europe certainly would have been under different, and they probably would have been under the religion of Islam, because Islam probably would have been founded. The Jewish culture was there, even if the Christians were not. Shortly after 632 AD, they spread through northern Africa up into Spain, into France, and they were going through Turkey and into Europe. Charles Martel, defender of the Cross Against the Crescent, engaged the Muslim invaders and defeated them soundly in Tours, France, and pushed them back out of France and eventually out of Spain. Today, those countries remain Christian countries to this day. The savior of Vienna and Western Europe, according to Pope Innocent XI, was Jan Sobieski, the King of Poland. And he worked in alliance with the Holy Roman Empire as the Ottoman Turks had the famous Battle of Vienna on September 11th and 12th, 1683. And this Muslim invasion was pushed back, and they never really came back into the European theater after this. Now, Hollywood and the popular media tell the world a rather false impression of Christianity. Movies show Christians as evil, intolerant, or stoopy. Examples are Carrie, Footloose, Dogma, and Inherit the Wind. And they also make statements like more people died in the name of religion than any other, and they cite Christianity, the Crusades, and the Inquisition. That is an outright false information. In the University of Hawaii, a professor by the name of Rummel did a study of the total number of people killed in world history. And this is not including the 1 billion in abortions. 50% was under the regime of Russia and China, certainly not Christian countries. The remainder was about the other 49.5%, and Christianity only accounted for 1/2 of 1%. If you look at, in the 20th century, the number of people that were killed, Joseph Stalin, Mao, Adolf Hitler, Chiang Kai-shek, Lenin, Tojo, Pol Pot, in the millions of people, these were godless states in which Christian restraints had been removed. The Crusades killed about 75,000. A lot of those deaths were the pushback from the Muslim invaders. The Inquisition was 31,000. The Inquisition was probably one of the worst examples of abuse of power in Christianity history. World War I, for example, 10 million people died. World War II, more people died in this war than in history. 72 million people died in World War II. 2/3 of them were civilians. And if we take a look at that, and the Soviet Union led the way. Half was military, half were civilians, and then on the right were the Jews that were killed in Soviet Union. China was next, Germany, Poland, Indonesia, Japan. Some of the people in China was through starvation. None of these were religious deaths or had anything to do with Christianity. Now, when we get into the dignity of human life, one of the things that Christianity gave was a caring, giving culture. Under the Roman empires, they had multiple gods. Prior to Muhammad, there were 360 gods. A lot of the Mayans and the Incas and some of the primitive cultures had multiple gods. In fact, in the Roman Empire, the king was made divine by a higher god. Merchants were made by a lesser god, and peasants and peasants and slaves were made by an inferior god. So there was definitely a dignity of human worth, and there was a gap there. Aristotle didn't believe men were created equal. A question by a professor to engineering students during the 1980s shows the impact of Christianity. When he asked his students, what is the most important thing to come out of a mine? The answer, the miner. Prior to Jesus' coming, human life was cheap and expendable. Jesus taught there is one God, and mankind is made in his image. Jesus healed lepers on Sabbath and taught the whole of the scriptures pointed to love. This worth and human dignity extended to children. This was not true in the ancient world. In the Roman Empire, many babies did not grow up at all. A practice called exposure would allow newborns during the first 8 days of life to be discarded on a dump or dunghill. Sometimes they might be rescued to be used as slaves. The most common reason to expose a child would be if the family lived in poverty, or if a wealthy family did not want more heirs to divide up their estate, or if a child was the wrong sex, meaning a girl, or if a child was deformed or appeared weak, or if the child was illegitimate. The Jews were opposed to exposure because of their faith. Then the child in Bethlehem grew up. He began to say things about children no one else thought of. When he was asked who would be the greatest in heaven, let me rephrase that. When he was asked who would be the greatest in heaven, Jesus called the little one to be the greatest in heaven, and later said, "Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me." A kingdom of children emerged 2,000 years before Walt Disney. The scriptures also reminded us, so in everything, do to others what you would have them do to you, for this sums up the law and the prophets. This increasing the value of human life by also elevated the value of women. Now, the Didache was the teaching of the apostles from 50 to 120 AD, and they prohibited widespread practice of abortion, exposure, and infanticide. Thou shalt not kill applied to parents as well. The life expectancy of 30 years meant the ancient world was full of orphans. For the first time, a community began to collect money to care for children indiscriminately. At baptism, children would receive godparents who would promise to care for them if their parents died. By the 4th century, a Christian emperor outlawed the practice of exposure for the entire empire. Over time, instead of leaving unwanted babies on dunghill, people began to leave them outside a monastery, church, community, or a church. The beginning of what was known as orphanages began to rise, usually associated with cathedrals. Whatever individuals may think of Jesus, they now live in a culture truly touched and changed by Christianity, and they view individuals differently because of Jesus. The ordinary and the lowly have great dignity. All children should live. Jesus also had the beginning of hospitals, Jesus and his followers. Luke 14 says, Jesus dined with Pharisees and healed lepers on Sabbath. Jesus, showing the whole law, pointed to love. Jesus noticed how people sat at dinner in places of honor. Jesus told the host to invite the next time the poor, the blind, the lame, the crippled. At this time, anything malformed or defective was considered by the Pharisees to be unable to reflect the perfect holiness of God. Nothing malformed was allowed within the precincts of the temple. Whenever any human being, no matter what his condition, was undervalued, Jesus' compassion soared. So Jesus' passion wasn't just for the victims, orphans, widows, poor, but also for the defective and the malformed. One of the primary reasons, according to many sociologists, for the rise of Christianity was the way his followers responded to sick people. The 15-year epidemic in 165 AD, the Antonine Plague, killed 5 million people, approximately 1/3 of the Roman Empire population. Deaths also included 2 Roman emperors. People responded in panic. No one to look after the sick. Dying people were put outside in the roads before they were dead. The ancient world noticed how Christian communities of followers of Jesus attended to the sick, attending to their needs, even when it meant they would also die to exposure. Jesus' reminder, "Whatever you did for the least of these, you did for me," rang in their hearts. In the early centuries of the church, leprosy meant isolation. In 360 AD, Church Father Basil of Caesarea built a place to love and care for lepers, despite the fact they didn't have money to pay for the care. That was the beginning of what would be known as hospitals. The Council of Nicaea in 325 AD decreed that whenever a cathedral existed, there must be a hospice to care for the sick and the poor. That is why today many hospitals have names such as Good Samaritan or Good Shepherd or St. Anthony. They were the world's first voluntary charitable institutions. Another follower of Jesus named Jean Dunant started an organization that became known as the Red Cross to help the wounded in battle. Interestingly, in a CNN online article on the contributions of the Muslim religion, they credit hospitals to the Muslims, with a hospital built in 832 AD in Egypt. This is interesting since Islam faith wasn't founded until 300 years after Christians were building hospitals. In verifying this, I found under Wikipedia the following under the history of hospitals. The first physicians under Muslim rule were Christians or Jews in conquered areas in the 7th century. The first prominent Islamic hospital was founded in Damascus, Syria, in around 707 AD with assistance from Christian doctors. Florence Nightingale became the founder of modern nursing. A Lutheran pastor in Germany named Theodor Fliedner trained a group of mostly peasant women to nurse the sick. In 1850, when a Florence Nightingale observed Fliedner and his nurses, it inspired her, and she is known today as the founder of modern nursing. She asked that when she died, she wanted only a cross with her initials on it. She wanted to serve God with no acclaim. In shopping malls, when people still hear ringing bells, part of an organization called the Salvation Army that flowed from the faith of William Booth. World Vision, YMCA, Samaritan's Purse, or Compassion International all sprang from the movement of Jesus. This is not saying there would be no compassion in the world without Christianity. Christians often fall short. In Jesus' story, known as the Good Samaritan, it is the least religious who shows the greatest compassion. But if you ask what is Jesus' influence on medicine and compassion, would suggest wherever you have an institution of self-giving for the lonely, for schools, for hospitals, for orphanages, for those who never be able to repay, this probably had its roots in the movement of Jesus. Jesus and Christianity and the equality of women. In the ancient world, there was a shortage of women. There were 40% more men in the world. Many women were left to die when born. Laws of Rome required raising all healthy male children, but only the firstborn female. Undervaluing of females is not limited today to the ancient world. In 1990, a report of the gender imbalance in China, India, and elsewhere was entitled, "The 100 Million Women Are Missing." In the ancient world, after the life of Jesus, and over a period of centuries, the gender imbalance began to change. The longest conversation recorded between Jesus and one other person is in John 4 with the Samaritan woman at the well. Men during the first century rarely spoke to women. Some commentaries have said the woman was unfaithful by having 5 husbands, or even maybe she was a prostitute. The scriptures don't say that. Her 5 marriages could have ended by the death of her husbands, or their rejecting her by divorce. She was now living with a man, not her husband, and Jesus points this out to show her sin. Jesus was in essence saying, I know you are poor, and your life is hard. I care about you. Jesus was doing something very subversive. He was treating a woman like someone with her own identity. Whenever Jesus traveled with his disciples from village to village, women were with him. Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Susanna, and many others were helping to support them out of their own means. This was radical, as women didn't travel with men and were expected to remain indoors. Jesus was planting seeds of change that would take centuries to grow. Women were not educated in the ancient world. Jesus was including women as disciples. During this time, a woman's highest calling was to bear children, particularly male children. When a woman in Luke 11 called to Jesus during his teaching and said, "Blessed is your mother, and her womb that bore you, and her breasts that nursed you," Jesus responded with, "Blessed rather are those who hear the word of God and obey it." Jesus' edgy response was in essence saying, "No, you are wrong. Motherhood, like fatherhood, is noble, but not the ultimate calling. If you don't have children, you have not missed out. The highest calling of a woman is the same as the highest calling of a man, to be a disciple." In Luke 10, Martha complains to Jesus that Mary is not helping her prepare the food. The description that Mary was sitting at the Lord's feet and listening is saying that she was learning and becoming a disciple of Jesus. Paul in the book of Acts says he sat at the feet of Gamaliel. When Jesus replied to Martha that Mary was making the better choice, he was inviting women to be disciples. In our culture today, at social get-togethers, men often hang out at the grill or barbecue, and women hang out in the kitchen. What Mary did was hanging out at the grill. Jesus' radical view of women meant they would begin to take an unusually prominent role of leadership in the early church. Approximately half of the households Paul mentions that formed the infrastructure of the early church are headed by women. At Pentecost, Peter explains that your sons and daughters will prophesy. In Acts 17, Priscilla's name is listed first before her husband, indicating she was the more prominent of the two. The first person Paul mentions in the final chapter of Romans in his greetings is a woman named Phoebe. Paul also greets Tryphena, Tryphosa, and Persis, please excuse my pronunciation, women who work hard in the Lord. In this chapter, Paul mentions 10 women, a very high percentage for writings of that era. In Philippians, Paul encourages 2 women to agree with one another. He described them as contending by my side for the cause of the gospel. These women were not serving behind the scenes, but doing similar work that Paul, Clement, and other co-workers did. This equality of women and the elevation of women was not felt in all countries, even in the last 2,000 years, especially those countries not influenced by the spread of Christianity. In India and some Asian communities, a process known as a ritual known as sati is a funeral ritual in which the widow commits suicide by jumping on her husband's fiery pyre. Failure to do so was a disgrace. This practice existed from 400 BC to 1829, when it was outlawed by the British in 1829. This ends part 1, and part 2 continues with looking at the impact that Christianity had on the education of all people, advancement in science, the founding of America, the abolition of slavery, and marriage as we know it today.